Grace asked me to give a talk on the impact of load shedding on the right to basic education. And I suggested that we take it much broader, given that there have been a few states of national disasters that have been declared. And these have all had a particular impact on the right to basic education. The first being COVID and also the flooding, which is also linked to climate change. So I wanted to talk more broadly for three reasons. Firstly, when Section 27 works, we usually want to talk from the basis of being very informed, either through having a sense of what the systemic issues are, through our clients coming into our paralegal office, or because there is some major study highlighting some systemic issue either in health or in education, which is our other area of work. On load shedding, there hasn't been that much. We haven't had a single case, nor has there been wide research. What there has been, and what I got one of the CAs to research for me, was to just look at what the articles, what the newspapers are saying, and I'll mention that. Second, I think it's important to talk about the other states, the other national disasters that we've had to deal with, because for one thing, international organizations are saying that COVID wasn't the only pandemic we are going to be dealing with. And there will be other pandemics. And how we respond to it within our national states respond to it, in our health systems, but also our education systems, it's important that we are more ready. Also, on a weekly basis now, we are hearing about flooding, heat waves, and all of that. And there's been a lot of developments internationally on also beginning to address the impacts of climate change. Secondly, why I wanted to talk about this, or thirdly, why I want to talk about this is because as Section 27, as did many other political parties and various other people, there was a lot of litigation during the COVID period, as you know. Some of it, most of it was unsuccessful in terms of Section 36 of the Constitution, but some of it was successful. And I thought it would be good to look at what worked and what didn't work when using legal interventions around that time. One of the cases that was successful was a case that was specifically run by Section 27, and that was to get the school nutrition program going again. So I will be talking about that. Before we do that, I just want to say a few things about the right to education broadly and about education in South Africa specifically. So to just say that during COVID, during the flooding, and whenever we see something that impacts on education, it tends to exacerbate inequalities and highlight those inequalities more than anything. And this is specifically the case with the right to basic education as well. And it's usually the most vulnerable learners that would be affected. So the first thing about the South African education system to say is that we have a dual education system. It's widely recognized by education researchers and by education rights lawyers like myself that we have a dual education system. What do I mean by a dual education system? We have private schools and the former Model C schools on the one hand, which are a small minority of schools, and then there are the large majority of schools. And what we see from both international studies that looks at learner performance and in terms of our own exams is that when you look at international studies, our learners, our wealthier learners, are performing on par with their international counterparts. And when we look at where our poorer learners are, those learners are at the bottom. We are performing lower than many countries, and we're performing even lower than countries that are much poorer than us. So that is quite a worrying thing. And many of you would know the Pearl study that has been repeated over and over, which is that in South Africa, grade 4 learners, 8 out of 10 learners can't read for meaning, and that's 78% of learners in South Africa. And then Nick Spall, who's an education researcher and quite a strong critique of our dual education system, noted that in 2018, of the top 200 schools, or all the distinctions, the most of the distinctions in maths came from the top 200 schools rather than the other 6,600 schools combined. Also to note that, as we know, apartheid was premised on an unequal education system. And in 1994, we introduced a new legal framework. And while this legal framework has done a few really good things, like desegregating education and having some pro-poor reforms, that hasn't been enough to address the inequalities in education in South Africa. And the majority of learners are still relegated to an under-par system of education. Then, and this is despite the fact that we have Section 29 in the Bill of Rights. Section 29 1A says everybody has the right to a basic education. It's also a very different right from the other socioeconomic rights in the Constitution. We distinguish between the qualified rights and the unqualified rights in the Constitution. The unqualified socioeconomic rights are the rights to health, the rights to housing, the rights to water, and so forth. And these are qualified internally by the terms progressive realization, and they're always subject to available resources and so forth. The right to basic education isn't. And our jurisprudence, starting in the Constitutional Court and repeated on a regular basis in the lower courts, notes that it's a socioeconomic right that must be immediately realized, and everybody has a direct entitlement to the right. Given this jurisprudence, progressive organizations like the ones I work for have been extensively involved in incrementalist litigation, looking to improve what we call the educational inputs in these disadvantaged schools. And in this way, we've made sure that in either provinces or particular areas, we've improved textbooks. In Limpopo, you would remember the Limpopo textbooks crisis. That was our case. Post-provisioning, there's been a lot of cases like that by the Legal Resources Center in the Eastern Cape. Furniture, desks and chairs, scholar transport, and so forth. So that is, in a nutshell, this vibrant jurisprudence. And how can we use it and how have we used it during the different states of national disasters in South Africa? So when COVID-19, I'll first talk about COVID-19, and then I'll talk about load shedding, and I'll touch very briefly on climate change. So when we had our first cases of COVID in South Africa, you know, it was, gosh, I can't even believe we're all sitting here today. But the first things that closed were schools. There was widespread panic. We didn't know what the science meant, how fast it would travel, how contagious it was, and so forth. And when they did that, there were many issues that arose, not just here in South Africa, but globally as well. The first was the transition to remote learning for most learners was very difficult because they struggled to access online learning. In South Africa, the 2018 General Household Surveys notes that 17% of households in the metropolitan areas have some home-based internet. This is compared to rural areas where it's 1.7% of rural households. UNICEF also noted that during the COVID period, access to technology and materials needed to continue learning while schools are closed is desperately unequal. Likewise, children with limited learning support at home have almost no means to support their education. Those of you with kids, all of us here, I would imagine, have kids in private schools like myself, or historically or former Model C schools. And we know that, there were initial wobbles, and it was never a perfect situation. And for those of you that like beer and braai on a cricket pitch, there was a lot to be missed. But more or less, our kids could sit in front of that computer every day and carry on learning. For most of the learners in this country, it didn't go so smoothly, despite programs being put out by the DBE and so forth. Issues around data, issues around access to the internet, and so forth. And one of the things I kept on thinking about is I kept on thinking about those early days with my own kids when they were in the foundation phase, teaching them the basics of literacy and numeracy. And you know how long it takes to sit with them with those first readers, teach them sums, and where you coming from an impoverished home, lack of education, just a whole lot of issues compounded. Can you imagine the learning losses for these kinds of kids learning to read at that particular stage? Also, both in South Africa and globally at the time, there were concerns about learners going hungry. In South Africa, we have 8.5 million children in the poorest schools that are fed daily. In terms of the National Food Nutrition Scheme, these meals will contain a carb, a starch, and a protein, and a few vegetables. And they obviously weren't getting that. It was a similar case around the world where there were 370 million children around the world that also miss meals. And immediately when COVID happened and schools closed, we started getting a lot of information, people calling us saying their children are going hungry. Our partner organization in Cape Town, Equal Education, that worked with young students called Equalizers, also started getting these narratives of hungry children. And we immediately started building this case. And what we did is we used a lot of these narratives of hunger, and they were really heartbreaking. When learners started going back to school, you would know that learners were phased in. And so a matric learner would then go back and get his meal. His sister in grade 11 or grade 10 wouldn't. And we had a story of this kind of siblings that were child-headed households. Their parents, the mother was living in Joburg because she was working prior to COVID and obviously couldn't get back. And this boy would go to school every day. That was his main meal, and his sister wasn't getting a meal. So that's just a kind of example of the case. And then we also got... we also relied on a lot of on expert evidence from Professor Jeremy Seekings at UCT that had done a whole lot of work on how food was not getting to people under COVID in the way that they were supposed to, or we were told that they were going to reach people during that period. So that was the other big issue. Then, obviously, in South Africa, there are many big schools that still rely on pit toilets. As you would know, we have litigated the Michael Komape case, and the Department of Education has to report to us in the Limpopo province on what they are doing to roll out their program to improve sanitation there. But generally, where there are pit toilets, the department had to bring in mobile toilets, water tanks, and masks to meet the directive set by the DBE. And where this wasn't met, we often threatened urgent court, or these schools didn't open in time. The third issue, because of the social distancing requirements, and in the context of huge overcrowding in underprivileged schools, was that these schools resorted to something called rotational learning, which was either 1 week off, 1 week on. But as a result of this, there were huge learning losses because of curriculum coverage. And some of the data coming out of that period showed that learners in the poorest schools lost between 50 to 75% of the academic year and didn't cover the curriculum. So you are being promoted, but you obviously didn't learn, and all these learning losses accrue. And what has happened also, we've had major dropouts during the COVID period. So we've had dropouts that have gone from, we've had dropouts of more or less 250,000 learners out of the system, usually in the senior phases, to now having going up to about 750,000 between March 22 and July 2021. So these were the kind of huge, the way in which inequality was exacerbated during the COVID period. As I said, we successfully ran the Equal Education and Others versus Department of Basic Education and Others case. And we got a structural order. We monitored, in terms of that order, the department had to report every 15 days what they were doing in terms of rolling out school meals. And eventually you could see that their systems of monitoring actually got better. Initially it was terrible. Initially a lot of it had to be verified by us. It was inaccurate, if not completely untruthful. We threatened to go back to court. Socioeconomic rights cases, we often go back to court more than once to ensure compliance with court orders. Those of you that do socioeconomic rights litigation will also know that supervisory orders have become much more common since the treatment action case in the early 2000s. So that was the successful case. There was also a very unsuccessful case, and that was brought by Muzi Maimane. And that was the One South Africa case. And he tried to change when, what do they call them? The NCC, what was the committee at the time? The controlling committee. When they tried to move from a high level of 4 to 3, he tried to stop that, and he tried to interdict the reopening of schools until what he said was a proper plan. And the court was quite scathing of that judgment, quite scathing of that case, which was brought by Dali Mpofu and others, and I'll try and keep a straight face here. Yeah. And the court was also very scathing of the way evidence was put forth and a lot of the generalizations that were made and all of that in that case. So the lesson is under this case, under these instances, is that the courts were much more were much less keen to give applicants the relief they sought. They were much more open to Section 36 limitations, given that there was a balancing of rights that was going on all the time. Firstly, in Muzi Maimane's case, there wasn't enough to show the kind of rights violations that were being alleged. On the other hand, there was the imperative to open up the economy again and all of that because of job losses and importance of having learners back at school for many, many reasons. Coming to the impacts of load shedding, as I said, most of this has just been doing some research on what people are saying in the news and so forth. As we know, we can have up to 10 hours of load shedding per day, and this has come at a huge cost to our country from an economic perspective, and to many of us, just in terms of our daily lives, going from one place to the other, having to cook, and all of that. Within the context of load shedding, the things that people are saying, where there's insufficient light, people are working in dark classrooms. There's often a lack of teaching aids, like overhead projectors. E-learning tools have become unpredictable. Technical and digital-based subjects are difficult during load shedding, and very difficult if you're writing exams, a technically based exam. Not getting to school on time because of traffic disruptions. I had a taxi go into the back of me the other day, going to fetch my child from school. Mental anxiety that comes with these kinds of disruptions. Will everything go according to plan? Will we have lights? will we get to school on time for our exam? But by and large, the greatest concern seems to be that you see repeatedly in all the newspaper articles that we scanned, was that learners have very few hours at night at home to study. Obviously not in our home where we have a generator and panels and all sorts of other things these days to make sure that we have light. But in many homes all over the country where people are struggling, and even in some of the wealthier homes, I live in Parkview, and as you drive to the suburb, you know exactly which houses have a generator, have solar, and which don't. So the Department of Basic Education has tabled a few proposals to ESCOM to address the issue of load shedding. The one is to say that during matric exams and during these these subjects that deal with technology and so forth, there shouldn't be any load shedding. The second is that they propose that in the evenings from 7 p.m. to 11 p.m., there shouldn't be load shedding. Let's see ESCOM listen to this one. But what I would suggest is that to the extent that we have legal interventions, that they should be brought in terms of our equality clause in Section 9, in our textbook and in terms of the right to basic education in terms of Section 29(1)(a). What was very successful in our textbook case, and what I think would be very successful in this kind of case, if it's ever brought, is to compare the households that are resourced with these alternative sources of energy with houses that aren't. So what they did in the textbook cases is that they looked at how learners who don't have access to textbooks, how they fare, and what their challenges are, what the impact is for them to study at night, to do their homework, and so forth, compared to kids that don't. And a similar comparative example could be made here. The other thing that we would say is that if they bring cases like this, most of our cases are very evidence intensive. So we look at the personal narratives, the stories of people's struggles to access a basic education or healthcare, or, in the old MTCT case, antiretrovirals or whatever it is, and we match that with the expert evidence or the scientific evidence. And that is how organizations like ours have been winning cases. The other thing to say is that the relief must be realistic and must serve to vindicate the harm that is being done. My understanding, I don't know enough about the load shedding, about the science of load shedding, but my understanding is we can't really ask schools and hospitals to be exempted in a particular area because we're all on the same grid. I think a better kind of relief would be to say, how do we get hospitals and schools off the grid? How do we make sure that there is solar energy or bigger generators at these to support these essential services? So those are the three things I would say about these kinds of cases. Finally, just to say around the impacts of climate change, we are seeing rising temperatures, and within the context of overcrowded classrooms and mobile classrooms, that's where you get overcrowding, and if you're lucky, the school sends you a mobile classroom. These are made out of metal, and they get very, very hot. And when they're overcrowded, it's very hot to learn in them. The other thing is that a lot of these schools are already dealing with are existing in dilapidated infrastructure. How often don't we deal with cases where there's a roof that's blown off, and it's safer for learners to study outside, except when it's raining, than to sit in a classroom where many, many things can go wrong. And in the KwaZulu-Natal floods, another national disaster, there were 630 schools that were damaged, 124 extensive damage, and there was an estimated 400 million in damages. Section 27 and my colleague, Matteo Brody, who made a submission to the Climate Justice Bill, one of the things that's required in terms of the climate justice bill is that you have sector adaptation and strategy plans. Funny enough, education is not included in that. Health is included in that, human settlements is included in that, and transport is included in that. Yeah, so I think as we are dealing with these global challenges and these South African challenges, we need to think more carefully about those who are more vulnerable, where we are dealing with legal interventions. How is it that we respond to these legal interventions? For us as an organization and with my colleagues in my international counterparts, there's a lot more strategic thinking that's going into not just looking for the next textbook case or the next infrastructure case, but thinking more holistically around these kinds of bigger challenges that we are experiencing. And I think we have to do that because we don't have a choice. Yeah, thanks very much. We have a magnificent education rights handbook. It's been quoted in court judgments. I've read more than one thesis that quotes it. We've just updated it, and we have a few copies with us. We normally give it to poor schools, poor school governing bodies for nothing. We do have a little, what do you call it? You can see where you can make a donation if you'd like a book. But if you are dealing with education cases, I would tell you it's the best go-to resource. Yeah, so if you want a copy, speak to my colleague, Matteo Brody. He's currently a CA at Section 27, future member of the bar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fanaz, for a most informative talk. I'm going to open up to the floor for questions or comments or insights from anybody. Chris.
Yeah. So, from what I've read, that disparity between well-resourced and under-resourced globally was exacerbated by COVID-19 and probably exacerbated by any similar experience. And I look at American literature, European literature, it says exactly what you said of the South African experience. Have you looked at that, and have we really reflected what is happening globally, or are we on our own in a different world? Is it something that's tracked throughout the globe, or are we unique?
It's a bit of a mix, I would say. So if you look at the UN agencies, like UNICEF, and what's the other one? It's UNICEF and UNESCO. They are all saying similar things, which is that the marginalized become more marginalized, the inequalities become more exacerbated, and so forth. But South Africa, we started from the lowest base possible, and that is because we started off with a very unequal education system. That's not to say that in America, for example, you also have very under-resourced schools based on the wealth tax in a particular community. But South Africa did have, under apartheid, a lot of the rural schools were built by communities, for example, and those either as farm schools or they were built by communities using mud bricks and so forth. So a lot of that kind of, I'm using that kind of infrastructure, and in the case of COVID, it would have been very small classrooms, for example, or a combined school with 3 classrooms catering to a huge school. So I would say that if inequality was very exacerbated during these kinds of disasters, we started from an even lower base, and therefore it would be even worse. Because of apartheid and because of all these issues we started off with.
And then the next question is, because it's also very current, we're talking about what then have you learned, and what is the response to the next disaster, and if you've learned something, what will you do differently?
Well, if you ask me, and if you ask our government, those are two different things. So I think we need a very different health system if we're going to respond to the next pandemic. We need a well-resourced health system. We need sufficient personnel to start, because I think that's one of the biggest issues we have in our public health system currently. We need to address corruption, obviously, so that money that's meant for PPE is not going elsewhere. Within the education system, I think we need to also do very similar things. So I think we need to make sure that should there be, this is much trickier because we used to have this debate during the textbook case, and Panyaza Lusufi would come to our office and he would say, oh no, we're giving every child tablets. In Gauteng, we want to give every child tablets. And we would say, but we can't give every child tablets when in Limpopo children don't even have textbooks. Let's start with textbooks and then we'll move on to tablets. But what we've seen and what's happened is that we've moved at a much more rapid rate towards remote learning. So for example, at university, I know there was a huge reluctance to even go back to in-classroom learning with some people. Remote learning is easy for lecturers. You play the same lectures that you did the year before. So I would say we need to look at these kinds of how you could have better e-learning, how you could better equip people to immediately go onto remote learning if you need to again. I think one of the things that we learned through the National School Nutrition Program case was that initially we had this huge debate with the department, and we used to threaten them with going back to court. And they were saying, but we are feeding learners on the days they are at school. It's just the days they're not at school. But if they come to school, we'll give them food. But some learners walk long distances to school. So we had to then make a suggestion that wasn't a very difficult, it was a practical suggestion, which was to say, if learners are coming every second day to school, give them the food for the day they're not there, on the day they are there. If they are coming to school on a weekly basis, you can give them a little packet of milli meal, or rice, whichever was the starch they were giving, a tin of pilchards or tins of pilchards, and or the beans or whatever was the protein and so forth. So I think we've learned some of those lessons. It's about how we would get to be able to communicate those lessons to the and obviously a lot of it always depends on political will. And what we also saw with the school nutrition case, at the beginning, there was no political will in that particular case to continue to roll out the school nutrition program. And by the end of it, there was such a shaming of government that went on that even today, last year, towards the end of the year, we had a pregnant learner that was kicked out of school because the chief in the area didn't want pregnant learners at that particular school. And we were going into urgent court the next day. We had the National Office DG call us, and his lawyers call us and say, please, just Section 27, we don't want you to take us to court. So maybe that's the lesson that they have learned and we do engage better. And not only with us, but they engage better with a lot of our civil society partners. So the extent to which they will do that going forth, I do know that in this budget, this last budget that just came out, on education, while we're spending less per learner than we have in previous years, at the same time, in terms of conditional grants for infrastructure, that has increased. And that's related also to a lot of our litigation around schools in Limpopo, sanitation, and also the recent flooding. So hopefully we are learning a few lessons. Possibly the hardest way, but we are.
Any other questions? So just from my side, and it's a very simple, there's an ongoing case at the moment about load shedding, and I think part A was argued this past Monday. And essentially the argument there is that load shedding has severe consequences, is severely detrimental to a range of human rights. I'm not really sure whether the right to basic education is one of them that's being listed, but is Section 27 involved in the case? Is it thinking about doing a case along those lines?
I think we would, as I said, when we decide to intervene in a case, there must be sufficient evidence of it being a systemic issue. I'm not saying that this isn't a systemic issue. And we must be able to make some kind of intervention that would be different to the applicants in this case. I have to say I haven't looked at the papers, largely because it's been a very busy period for us and other things, but also, yeah, it's been quite a contentious case politically. And when we tend to stay out of those kinds of political cases unless it is so significant that we get involved. So for example, another COVID case that we were involved in but settled was, I don't know if you will remember, the ACDP case. They tried to stop the rollout of the vaccine to teenagers. And we felt that, it was in the public health interest. And obviously a parent can decide whether or not their child will be vaccinated. But we didn't want to stop the rollout of the vaccine. So we got involved there, and we got involved with a lot of evidence of overcrowding in schools. And eventually the case was settled, I think also because we were involved. People like Dr. Karam had made extensive, responded extensively in his affidavit with the science and all of that. So yeah, no, I don't know. I don't know if anybody else knows if the right to education. I don't think it was. I didn't, somebody would have alerted me to it. But I don't think it was. And I don't think we'd want to get involved in that case politically.
I mean, it just occurred
Lawfare is not our thing.
It just occurred to me that at the most basic level, a case which said, well, isn't there an obligation on the part of the state to provide generators, for example,
Yeah.
In order to assist people to be educated effectively?
I think that's the case that could be made. Or solar.
Or some form of alternative energy.
Yeah.
If there's an obligation to produce textbooks, then there must be an obligation to make that that education meaningful.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I do know that there are schools that are applying to the department for various, for solar panels and all of that. So that is happening. Also, when we get cases, we don't, if we find, we don't go out and ambulance chase for clients. Well, maybe sometimes we do, but we wouldn't call it ambulance chasing.
Isn't that what Section 27 does?
No. Generally, we get people coming to us. No, we're trying to get ambulances to work in the Eastern Cape, by the way. You can't even chase them because they just don't exist in the Eastern Cape. But yeah, so if there are more complaints coming to us from the people that we represent, and there's sufficient evidence to say that, this is really impacting their day-to-day. If the biggest issue is that they can't study at night, then we can't be asking for a generator in the day. So, we'll have to evaluate it as well when we get those complaints. We haven't had them to date.
If you don't mind, just the statistics, how many people are there at school?
There are 24,000 schools, I think, in South Africa.
And scholars?
Scholars, I don't know how many scholars. There are 24,000 public schools, around that number. And then there's a small, I think less than 6% private schools. And that's not the kind of elite private schools, but there's also been quite a rapid increase in what we call low-fee private schooling and medium-fee private schooling.